Hello and welcome to our first budget information meeting presentation for the fiscal year 2019-20. This year we are giving presentations regarding our budget as a way to disseminate information about our budget and also to receive feedback from stakeholders regarding our budget process. So this is the first of a series of presentations, and the presentations will start with a broad overview of the budget process for the school district and requirements that we need to follow as a school district. And then later sessions we'll get into more detail regarding specifics about our revenues, expenditures, and some of the challenges that Rincon Valley is facing with its budget. So for today's presentation, the objectives will be to gain a better understanding of our budgetary process and requirements. As a school district, we have quite a few regulations we need to follow, and there's a process that the district has to legally follow, and the certain requirements that we have to stay within these guidelines. We'll talk briefly about the LCAP cycle and the impact it has on the budget. The LCAP is a local control accountability plan, and that is another requirement of ours, and it does affect our budget. In fact, it's in some ways the main driver for our budget. We will talk about significant sources of revenue, and by the end of this, you should be able to identify what our sources of revenue are and how they're generated. And then, of course, in general terms, know where RVUSD spends its money. And we're not atypical for a school district. And you'll see that later in the presentation about how we are in a people business, and most of our money goes to pay for people. To start with, though, the first thing we want to talk about is the funding that the state provides for school districts in California. So we have a chart here that's from 2015, which is, although the numbers have increased nationwide, the point of this slide is still accurate. And you can see here in for the state of California, that we have funded in 2015 on average school districts at 11,786. So we're ranked just above Texas, but far below some of the other states, especially out east in the Midwest. You can see that there's significantly more spending per pupil on education, and for the main reason for that is Proposition 13, which basically caps the district's access to local property taxes, which forces the district to have to rely on the state for additional funding to come up with a minimal per pupil. These other states, they are able to tax at a greater rate because they're able to access property taxes. And when they have the property taxes, that actually exceeds the amount that we receive from the state. And so many of those districts don't receive, they receive virtually no funding from the state. So they're not dependent on the state, they're dependent on their local community. But we do not have that luxury in California, so we are significantly underfunded. And the reason I bring this up is that with all the changes we've had over the last decade in school funding, it was basically a redistribution of resources for the funding model. There wasn't an increase into the system. So we're getting traditionally the same amount that we've gotten through what's known as Proposition 98, and the state follows the guidelines for that, but that didn't add any money into an underfunded system. So we're just reshuffling the deck with the same money. So until that changes, there are going to be struggles in the state in terms of keeping up with providing the same level of services and pay as other states can afford because of just the lack of funds. So if you look at Rincon Valley's sources of funding, there's three: local, state, and federal. In fact, all the school districts in the country, this is essentially the three types of funding they get. Local, meaning local from your local community and area. State, basically funding from the state, and federal funding through the federal government. So as where local sources, like local property taxes, for instance, are a very stable source of revenue, the state collects this money in different ways. It doesn't really get the property taxes. Those get redistributed to the local school districts and local governmental agencies, but the state collects things like capital gains taxes. The main source is income taxes. So during the recession, when people are making less money, they're paying less into the state, and therefore they're stressing the state government, which is budget, which is why when we have a recession that the state ends up cutting school funding because they simply don't have the revenue coming in, and it creates a very unstable system. Back pre-Proposition 13, when the district relied on local property taxes, for the most part, that was very stable. Everyone has to pay their property tax bill, but if you're not paying income, you don't pay your income taxes. So therefore, the school funding under a system of local property taxes is very stable, where the state one tends to be fairly erratic because of their sources of funding. And then we have the last one, of course, is the federal government also contributes to the school districts, and the federal government distributes to different districts differently. In Rincon Valley's case, it's actually a very small amount, even though we still have to follow all the federal requirements that are mandated. We don't really receive a tremendous amount of funding from them. Most of our funding you'll see for federal money is for our food service program. So if you take a look at break those three sources into four major categories, because sometimes they're blended, especially with the first category. The LCFF, or the Local Control Funding Formula, which is our main source of funding, that's a combination of property taxes and state aid. So the way that works is the state will, and this is nationwide, any school district that receives state aid, generally the state determines a minimum per pupil, and if you don't collect that with your local property taxes, then the state will contribute state aid to your school district. So that in Rincon Valley's case, that's what we're getting. There are a few school districts in the state that are so property tax wealthy, even with Proposition 13, they don't need to receive any state aid to meet that minimum or exceed it, but that's not the case with Rincon Valley. Other state funding are sources that come in, and that would be lottery, mandate grants. In other words, when the state requires the district to do something, they mandate a service or something that we need to do, they are supposed to provide money to pay for that service. So that's another type of state funding. And then categorical funding is also part of their funding. So the state may have some initiative they want, for instance, maybe some kind of professional development initiative, and they'll dedicate money towards that program, and it can only be spent in that program. And we like to think of these programs like silos, where they can only be spent on a certain way, and that's what the state does. It'll give us that money, but it can't be used for general purposes or teacher salaries or things like that. It has to be used for whatever that program is intended for. Then we have our federal programs, title nutrition programs, title programs, which are federal programs. We have Title 1, 2, 3, and 4, and those have various focuses from underserved students to English learning students or professional development. And then the final category is other local, and that would be things such as the parcel tax that Rincon Valley has. It would be the Redwood Consortium for Student Services, which is a consortium that we run, and the taxes we receive from it are to fund the program, and we receive that from local school districts. And then we have all the sites have donation accounts of various amounts, so the parent club may give this school money, and it goes into a local revenue source in our budget, and it's spent from that for the school where it's donated generally. So those are our four major categories. The local control funding formula is the main source of the district's revenue, often referred to as LCFF. Although there was an attempt to simplify the formula, there's actually quite a few components to it, and there's many seminars that have been given on the local control funding formula that can easily last half a day to a day. So we're not going to get into that level of detail, obviously, on this type of presentation, but we just do want to talk about some of the basics. So the formula incorporates a few factors into to generating revenue through the formula, and the first one is average daily attendance, known as ADA. So the district actually receives no money for enrollment. It receives money for students who actually show up to school. So the enrollment is typically generates the ADA. So typically, like for instance, in Rincon Valley's case, we're about 97% of our enrollment is our ADA. If we have, there's been some years with a bad flu, and that can affect it, and the ADA goes down, so therefore our revenue goes down. But the formula uses the average daily attendance as one factor in generating revenue per students. And then the formula basically works with having this average daily attendance multiplied by an amount, and the amount is determined by the type of different district demographics you have. So the first factor is the base grant, which is for every student. So every student gets a minimum amount from the state that's guaranteed, and that's the amount that the ADA is multiplied by. But the base grant can be also enhanced by depending on how many unduplicated students you have in the district. And what is meant by unduplicated, it means that you can't count the student more than once in this category. So for instance, the free lunch fits into this category, and so does English learners and foster youth. But they don't count twice. So if you have a student on free lunch who happens to also be an English learner, that counts for your supplemental money, but they don't count twice. They just count once. So that's why thus the term unduplicated. So that's also an add-on of the base grant. And then if the district has above 55% unduplicated count, then there's additional money for those students too. That there's a bonus for the districts that have a high number of free lunch and English learners that typically tend to be high poverty areas. And then there's also an add-on for grade span adjustment for K3 and 9-12. In the past, there was a class size reduction revenue that got rolled into this formula. And so this is a way that for school districts that keep the low class size, like Rincon Valley to K3, there's an add-on to this formula. So generally, the local control funding formula didn't add any additional revenue. It's been increased every year by Prop 98, but there's no additional revenue than there was before under the old system. It's just it's a redistribution model, not really a new, not really enhancing any revenues to school districts. And it favors districts that have a higher unduplicated count. So the statewide average is 65%. Rincon Valley's is about 37%. And so what that means is every time the state puts money into the system, Rincon Valley is on the short end of that funding because if the state, for instance, adds 3% into the LCFF formula, Rincon Valley will get less than 3% because we have less than the average unduplicated count, which is about 65% statewide. Our unduplicated count is approximately 37%. So this formula did not favor Rincon Valley because of our demographics don't meet the criteria to maximize the revenue from this funding source, and this is our main source of funding. So other common state forms of funding include the low performing block grant, and these are categoricals. And we have a classified professional development grant. The lottery is another state source of revenue, and in future sessions we'll take a look exactly what these specifically lottery produces for us. It's less than most people think. There's a preschool grant. Some of these are ongoing, like lottery is basically the district can count on as long as there's a lottery of getting some money. And then some things like the preschool grant, we've been told are one time. And so these all need to be spent on the category they're intended for. So preschool grants, obviously for preschool students. Lottery can be used for textbooks and other educational materials. And there's also a few items in our budget that I would consider that are kind of like pass-through items, like the education protection account may be referred to. There's a spreadsheet posted on our website about how it's used, but essentially it was a tax increase, that required that we track the money due from the extra taxes separately. And so basically there's an accounting entry that happens to account for this, for these funds. It's, although the tax increase initially produced more funding to us, it's part of our budget, and really year by year it doesn't increase, what we receive. It's part of the LCFF calculation. And then there's the STRS and PERS, which are the retirement systems for our employees. And these systems basically send us a paper entry to do every year. So we book a revenue into our books, but we actually never receive the money, and we book an expenditure in our books, but we never really expend the money. It's retirement payments from the state, and the state used to make these directly to the retirement system, but they changed their process and now send the paper entries to us to book. And so although we don't really have any, we don't really pay these out or receive the revenue, we do make the entries, and it's in our budget, but it's not really an area we control, because it's basically part of the state's retirement obligation that they're basically having us book. So with the LCFF, which was, by the way, Jerry Brown's probably legacy legislation, came the Local Control Accountability Plan, which is also part of Jerry Brown's legacy, so to speak. And this is a plan that comes up with a plan on how we're going to address educational needs of the district, and it ties in with our budget. So what's in the plan has to be funded for in the budget, and the county actually checks to make sure that whatever we have in this plan is in the budget when we submit it. But it has an annual update in the fall, and then it has dashboard data that comes out later in the fall. And basically there's a lot of collaborative planning that goes on with stakeholders in the district, and we have engagement meetings and try to reach out to different constituencies to see what they would like in this plan. And then there's also a board hearing in June, and it's approved at the meeting in conjunction with the budget. So it's this is like a sister component of our budget. The local control accountability plan, the local control funding formula go hand in hand, and then in many ways this drives what's in our budget. So if we start taking a look specifically at Rincon Valley, and take a look at last year when we closed the books. And closing the books basically means we get to the end of the year and we make all the accounting entries so that we can have accurate statements for the whole year. Once we do that, we can take a look at our funding for the general fund. Now, the school district has a few funds, but all of the educational activities are in the general fund, along with things like maintenance and custodial services, transportation, all wrapped up in this big, approximately $40 million general fund. So if you look at our revenues for that fund, you can see the LCFF is basically the 500-pound gorilla in the room. It's 70% of our revenues, and it basically funds most of what we do. And then next in line is other local, which is 17%, and that's normally would not be that large in a elementary school district, but the fact that we have a special ed consortium that has members who pay revenues that get classified as other local bumps that up. And that's the Redwood, the Rincon Valley Partnership, RVP, and those revenues I think are approximately $4 million a year. So without those, that percentage would be much smaller. We have the parcel tax that's also included in other local revenue, and like I mentioned, donations and a few other various things. Other state revenue is 11%, and that's, of course, varies every year because the state can give a categorical some years and pull back the categorical, especially when money's tight at the state level. They will fund LCFF first before they will implement new categoricals or possibly continue other or pre-existing categoricals. And then the federal percentage is only 2%, very, very small percentage of our budget, and those are all on federal categoricals that money's spent on that have to be spent in a certain way and not for general uses. If we take a look at the flip side of our reports, we can see what our benefits look like. And there's really no surprise here. We spend almost 60% of our benefits, of our money in salaries, another 20% in benefits. So the lion's share of our expenditures go to people, and that makes sense because we're in the people business. We educate people with people, and we're in the service industry. We serve people, and to do that, you need a substantial staff. We're not manufacturing. We're buying iron ore to make things, but we're paying our people to work with other people. So that's pretty typical for an elementary district. It's a very high percentage. And then we have smaller percentages for books and supplies, about 6%, and then services is 8%. A lot of the services tend to fit into two categories. There's certain students that we can't serve here in the district, and so we outsource them to schools that they can be served at, and so which is rather costly, and so that's part of the services. And although we try to keep all the students in house, some have needs that we just can't meet in the district. And the other thing is the maintenance fund is also part of this budget, and they have services that they purchase because there's certain things that we don't have in-house expertise to accomplish, or they're just too big a project for our staff to handle. And that's under services. And then a small amount for capital outlay. Capital outlay is anything over $5,000. And there's might be a few items in our budget that we have to purchase for over there. For instance, if we're replacing a vehicle or a piece of big equipment, that would be part of our capital outlay, but a very small part of our budget. So the second part of this presentation we'll discuss the district requirements for the budget process and what the county's role is in overseeing our school district. The several, at this point, probably a couple of decades ago, there were some districts that became financially insolvent. Probably the most famous one is Richmond Unified, which is now known as West Contra Costa. And when the school district became financially insolvent, then the state takes over the school district. It's very expensive for the state to do that. So they want to ensure that school districts do not fall into financial hard times to the point where they have to be taken over. So they pass legislation, most famously AB 1200, which requires this county to monitor our financial activities and for us to meet certain requirements. So you can look at our budget reporting timelines, and sometimes I believe people are confused with our timelines because we're really running two cycles at once. So for instance, the district in September passed our unaudited actuals. So you can see towards the bottom of our screen that the unaudited actuals are almost towards the end of the budget cycle. So there's in 2019, that is in September, that is what the board passed, was right here. That's the board passed the unaudited actuals, and that's basically the year-end statements for the district, and then they're confirmed by the audit in January, and that will conclude that fiscal year. The audit is the last step in the whole process. But the current budget is actually, which is up here, is actually was passed in June, and then it was we're in the process of updating it for the first interim. So this is on a separate cycle, but both budgets have to go through the same process where there's an original budget and then a first interim where the budget's updated in the fall, and that's due to the county in December. Then there's a second interim, which is supposed to fine-tune the budget so that the statements are as accurate as possible. If the district's in financial distress, there would be a third interim. Rankin Valley doesn't need to do that. We have then unaudited actual report, which is the one, like I mentioned, the board has, and that's the year-end statements after we close the books. And then the audit confirms that. So there's a certain cycle we have to follow as school districts, and it's pretty regular, and there's actually two cycles happening at any given time during the year. When we send our budget off, and actually before we send it off, We have to take a look at that, and the superintendent of schools for the school district and myself have to decide if what status the budget is. So if we look at our projections, and it looks like that we can pay our bills for the next 3 years, we receive a positive certification. And that's where we want to be. There's there's financial stability that comes with having a positive certification. There's certainly a lot of extra work for staff if the budget goes into qualified or negative. There's an extra report to do. It also hurts our credit rating. So we don't want the budget to go anything but positive. In the history of the district, the budget has always been positive. Some districts, and actually some area districts, end up being qualified. So when we have a qualified budget, you may be able to pay for your bills for the next 2 years. And of course, you may not be able to. So that's a concern, and that has to be stated on the report when we turn it into the county. And then if it's negative, that means that it doesn't look like we're going to be able to pay our bills over the next 3 years, and that we have some serious issues. And so the school district has to self-certify this. And then, but the self-certification for the school district isn't the final say, because the county, the district has to submit all of these reports to the county, and the county is required by law to review them and opine an official letter about our certification and our budget in general. And they can reject our certification. They can approve it, which they've always done with Rincon Valley, but they could reject it, or they could conditionally reject it and ask you to change something. They could disagree with your certification and send it back to be changed, and the district has to respond to that. So the county has quite a bit of authority and quite a bit of expertise. Actually, Sonoma County Office of Education, their business services division is very, very on top of this, and they will send us the budget back if they don't feel that it's accurately reflects our financial position. And part of what we are required to have in our budget are reserves. So they're a legal requirement. We must have reserves. So the state reserve is a minimum of 3%. The Rincon Valley's board has a reserve policy of 15%. Now, on the onset, that may seem large. Why, if the minimum requirement is 3, why do we have 15? So there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First off, the 3% is minimum. That's the least. Okay, so that's not, sometimes that's talked about, it's brought up like that's, 3% is the cap. It isn't. That means you have to have at least 3%. Districts that operate with a 3% reserve have all sorts of problems because the problem is the industry we're in is not possible to 100% accurately project everything in your budget. So therefore, if you're at the 3%, you have to be very conservative in the budget processing, which means you may end up having to cut back programs that to get to your 3%, and that if you had had a bigger percentage, you may have had a little more time to see if the budget projections will actually materialize, rather than having to slash programs right away. So the reserves are good to have. They give stability, and they buy time for the district to react to conditions. The other thing is reserves are used for cash flow. For instance, for Rincon Valley, our low cash point in the year is October, and last year we hit approximately $3 million. So even though our fund balance, which is there's a difference between fund balance and cash balance, the fund balance basically has accrued revenue, which means we haven't actually received the cash. We have an IOU. So when we close the books at the end of the year, we may have a fund balance of $9 or $10 million. But there's much less of that in actual cash. So when we get to October, before our property taxes come in with the state, from the county, the cash can get low, and if it gets too low, we end up having to take a loan, either something called a trans, or have to borrow from the county, which means we start paying interest on the money we're borrowing. And if you take out a trans, there's actually a financing cost for the trans. So you're basically spending money to just be able to make your own payroll, which is it's a negative impact on the budget and can spiral because, the more money you're borrowing, the more interest you're having to pay on it. And so you're paying money for interest that could be going to, to run the school district. Also, our reserves are quite average if you take an objective look at that. If you look at our latest investing report, there's a couple of agencies that rate our bonds, and the famous one is Moody's Investor Service, Standard & Poor's, and another. And you can read the reports. They have advertised our reserves as average for an elementary school district nationwide. And so that's also another indicator that they're appropriate. And if you actually look at elementary school districts and rank them in the state in terms of the reserve levels, the district is also about average. So the reserves are required. Ours are about average for a school district. We also use them. We have to build up reserves if we're buying textbook adoptions. Like, for instance, we're looking at a science textbook adoption. There's not enough money in the budget to pay for that. That's going to have to come out of a reserve. And once it does come out of the reserve needs to be replenished over time so that we can buy future textbooks adoptions. If we keep using reserves, are essentially one-time money. If you pay for things out of reserves, then what can happen is if you don't replenish your reserves, the next time you go to use them, you'll draw them down, and then there won't be anywhere to go for especially new textbook adoptions is generally the big one. Although a lot of our technology purchases also came out of reserves. The next steps for our budget information sessions are going to be, we're going to answer questions to any questions that are brought up in the session, and any ones that are emailed to me. Dates for next sessions are on the district calendar, and we'll send those out to anyone interested. And then the topics for future discussion include details on our revenues and expenditures. So we're going to do a deeper dive into those specific areas, particularly lottery, partial tax, basic aid supplemental, the Ed Foundation. We'll talk about uses of our bond funds. Future sessions will also talk about enrollment projections, strategies to increase funding, and other areas of our budget that will need addressed. So thank you again, and please email me if you have further questions.